The Museum of Flight on historic Boeing Field in Seattle is a world-class center for collecting and preserving aviation's proud heritage. Through events like FlightFest, the Museum of Flight lets you meet the people and learn about the machines that made and are making aviation history. Become a member of the Museum of Flight and visit often. You never know on what adventure you'll take off next.
Airplanes, like any machines, are only as good as the people who design them and the people who fly them. The airplanes of World War II were designed by some of the best and flown by some of the best. Hello, I'm aviation journalist and pilot Rick Price at the Museum of Flight in Seattle, and this is a Boeing B-29. This super fortress is just one of many famous airplanes of World War II featured in FlightFest95 here at the museum during the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. Join us as we look back at these great machines and the people who flew them on Wings of Freedom.
The most celebrated aircraft of World War II was born right here on Boeing Field, the B-17. A Seattle Times reporter covering the aircraft's rollout in 1935 called it a flying fortress. Boeing company officials liked the name so much, they registered it as the aircraft's trademark. At the peak of the war, 3 separate aircraft companies were building 400 B-17s a month, more than 12,000 in all. Today, only a handful remain as living examples of what was the right aircraft at the right time.
Flight instruments, check. Fuel left, rights on main. On the main. Cross speed switch off. Off, trim all 3. 1, 2, and 3 are set for takeoff.
Another World War II aircraft would likely have been just as famous as the B-17, except it was the right aircraft that ran out of time.
Wing flap, 15. 15. Carburetor, air temps, cold. Cold. Mixtures, auto rich. Auto rich. Flaps, full increase. Full increase. Superchargers, low and lock. Low and lock. Engine instruments, check.
The Douglas A-26 Invader, with its almost square fuselage, didn't see action until late 1944. When the war ended just months later, few came to realize the A-26 carried twice the bomb load required in the original specification and exceeded every performance guarantee.
And Boeing Tower, Douglas 53, it's ready for takeoff, 13, and be letting close traffic for low approaches.
Bristling with machine guns and loaded with bombs in its belly and on its wings, the A-26 was an awesome machine. This view out the bombardier's window gives you an idea of the speed and agility with which the Invader could attack an enemy target. Douglas produced fewer than 2,500 Invaders. This rare surviving example is owned by a California company which takes advantage of the aircraft's big plexiglass nose as a flying camera platform, just as we did.
Well, back then we had radio. Certainly was very powerful. You know, that's how a lot of people received their information. We had newspapers, and then we had posters. The posters are divided here into 3 categories. There's a very patriotic posters. Those are the posters that were instilling pride into the American people. They were, you know, red, white, and blue, stars and stripes, powerful images of soldiers that couldn't possibly lose a war, very strong, active American people. And their whole concept was to just give the people a very patriotic spirit and to maintain that spirit throughout the war. And those were quite popular, especially at the beginning of the war when they had to recruit, when they wanted people to buy war bonds and things like that.
And even if you can't be a soldier in the ranks, you can be the guy that helps supply the guns and planes and tanks. This is the time for you to do your best. This is no time for you to take a rest. The enemy is reeling and his morale is low. So now's the time to fall in line and deal the final blow. Buy a bond. And by, the bonds you buy will bring you victory. Buy a bond. And you'll be standing by the victory arch when Johnny comes smashing home again. Oh, you should need no request. For after all, you know that you're investing in the best. So the lads come back again, back to the old attack again. Buy.
Rick, I'll be out there for a minute. The rest of the public.
The Museum of Flight in Seattle, Washington begins planning for an air show months before the first airplanes ever arrive.
At 10:15 today, the F-15s are going to arrive. So when the antiques get ready to go, we want to make sure they're not in their way.
There are news releases to send out, T-shirts to print, and meetings to make sure everybody keeps safety in mind.
This year we want to avoid mixing the fast one with the slow one, the big one with the small one.
The planning pays off when the first of 15,000 guests arrive in eager anticipation of the museum's 8th annual air show.
There you go. Enjoy your day. There you go.
A memento of this glorious occasion. So cool. Love those shirts.
Oh, what a nice shirts, aren't they?
Yeah.
Enjoy your day.
Thanks.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to FlightFest95, our Wings of Freedom air show. That's Tom McArthur.
Please join with me and stand for the presentation of the national flag and the colors of the armed forces by the Joint Services Color Guard from Fort Lewis, Washington.
Sing us that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Some of the highlights of this year's air show, which commemorates the end of World War II, the 50th anniversary of that date, is the B-17, the A-26, the P-51 Mustang, the Japanese Zero, and a whole lot of other airplanes that you'll see flying today.
They're back. To your left again, our flight of 5 AT-6s.
Bill Brubaker has been announcing air shows for almost 20 years. Of all the air shows he's enjoyed from the announcer's stage, FlightFest is his favorite.
The one reason I like this air show, and I do like this one the best of all, is because of the history involved. And the guys who fly these airplanes, the airplanes that you see, the warbirds, the people out there, the public would never get to see these things if it weren't for a lot of people who work a lot of hours at no profit to themselves or anybody else to restore these airplanes so people can see them. And that to me is just a special thing, and I really like to support that. I mean, these guys literally throw their lives into these airplanes and restore them, and if they didn't do it, nobody would ever see them.
One of the people who keeps these old warbirds alive is Bud Granley.
Bud Granley, will you please report to your airplane? Your instructor is waiting.
I guess it's time to go fly.
Granley learned to fly in an airplane just like this one, called a T-6 in the Army Air Force, an SNJ in the Navy, and a Harvard in the Canadian military. 20,000 of these aircraft were produced as trainers for Allied pilots during the war. Granley and 6 partners invested in this aircraft in 1977 and have kept it flying ever since.
What I'm doing is it's an academic deal, so what you're doing at an air show is what you do is you practice things and you do things that you've practiced before that may look spectacular to the people, but really that should be just a rehearsed thing that looks spectacular. So basically what you do is you make the difficult look easy, the easy look spectacular, and never do the impossible.
Ladies and gentlemen, direct your attention now to the main runway. To your left, from Bellevue, Washington, Mr. Bud Granley in the T-6. He's added power to that heavy old trainer, and he will show you and demonstrate some maneuvers with that airplane unlike any other pilot that you or I know. Air show smoke is on. Wheels are coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, as he gets directly in front of you, Bud Granley will not depart the area in the normal way, but will have to add his own signature to his own air show. Nose is coming up, and snap rolls the aircraft on takeoff in less than 500 feet. Sufficient airspeed, Bud will pull back on the stick, pull that heavy 4,700-pound airplane straight into the air. Straight up he'll go, rolling the aircraft as he climbs. 1,000, 200, 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, 1,500 feet, bringing the aircraft, pulling it back over the top, and on the way down, we'll do another one-half roll, and that one-half roll will put him right directly along the show line, exactly where he wants to be. We'll pull back on the stick again and head up into the sky. Slows it almost to a stop, in fact, to a stop, and performs a tail slide as he comes back down through the smoke, breathing that junk that he's spewing out behind the airplane. I did tell you, didn't I, folks, that stuff is made from vegetable oil and not petroleum. It's biodegradable. The worst thing that can happen to you from breathing it is you'll gain weight. All right, back in the stick he goes. He forms a loop, and on top of the loop he's going to do something a little different. Not just a normal loop. Snap rolls the airplane on top of the loop, finishes the snap, finishes the loop in a perfect circle with a whip-dang in the top part of that. Now, we don't recommend that you approach to a landing this way at Boeing Field or any other field, but it is a rather unique way to come into the pattern. Looping, a dirty loop to a landing configuration will set the airplane down on the runway. Looks like he's only going to do it with one wheel, however, and then he was going to pull it off again. There it is, a one-wheel touch and go, back into the air. Now gently rolling the airplane, still in the dirty configuration. And another touch and go, but barely, because he was running out of runway. Well, Bud says no sweat. He still had 12.5 inches of runway left. Okay, another patented maneuver for Bud Granley as he closes out his act here at FlightFest95, the Wings of Freedom Air Show. His Goonie Bird pass, gear down, flaps down. He's just doing a lot of cross-controlling of the controls and just waltzing his way down the show line. Bud will be bringing the T6 to the very spot from which he took it out of here.
How precise?
Oh, it looked like fun. It was fun. It's fun. It's actually fun thinking about it. It's really a lot of work.
Bud Bradley, will you please report to your airplane? Your instructor is waiting.
The second group of posters is the conservation posters. And those are the ones directed at mostly housewives, getting them to can, getting them to save their grease fats from their kitchens. There was, of course, the rationing was big, and everybody was rationing some one form or another of some kind of a product or service. Gasoline, of course, was rationed. So those posters really educated people and kept them apprised of the necessity to continue to conserve materials, recycle, tin cans, aluminum cans, metals, scrap metals, things like that. You know, you didn't go down and buy new tires for your car. You just ran with what you had, or you just put it off till after the war. I mean, it was those kinds of messages.
Eastern Wartime, Bob Height reporting. In a little over an hour and a half, the last German forces in Europe will lay down their arms and the fighting will be officially over. The end of nearly 6 years of war for many Allied troops. Here at home, as in the rest of the Allied world, the day has been spent in celebration and in prayer at the end of the European war. Only a few war plants closed down, however, and for the most part workers stayed on the job. In Philadelphia, the Liberty Bell was rung. And in New York at 8:30 tonight, the torch on the Statue of Liberty will be relighted for the first time since Pearl Harbor. Bob Height reporting. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
World War II is remembered as the Air War, the first conflict in which air power decided the outcome. On D-Day in 1944, Allied aircraft were painted with black and white invasion stripes so that friendly and deadly aircraft could be told apart. Several aircraft at FlightFest95 are restored to the way they would have looked that June morning 50 years ago. Invasion stripes are just one of the details model builders use to make their kits closer to the real thing.
He's got the seat belts, the instrument panel, control yoke, the gun sight, map pockets, radio, everything is in there in a much reduced scale that was in the original. If you walked out to the real one on the flight line out here, which is the same version, it's P-38J, you could relate everything that's here to the real airplane.
The Museum of Flight hosts the Northwest Scale Modelers. Here, together with members of the International Plastic Modelers Society, they display their models of aircraft from World War II. Jim Schubert got his start with models as a youngster and never outgrew his fascination with them.
The interest is maintained by working it into, I would say, a fine art detail, whereas a youngster might buy a kit in the museum shop and glue it together and put the decals on and be very pleased with what he's got. I was when I was small. As you get older, you want a little more, so you do some historical research. You correct any faults in the kit. You don't just glue it together. You assemble it very carefully. You paint it very carefully to reflect an actual specimen. Most of these do reflect actual airplanes.
All of a sudden, a strange new airplane flew in. It was the Corsair, and it was a beautiful airplane.
While many people enjoy building models of World War II aircraft, few get the chance to rebuild the aircraft they actually flew. Vern Salisbury is one of those lucky few. The strange new airplane he flew way out in the Pacific a half-century ago now sits, in better-than-new flying condition, in the museum's Great Gallery.
Well, you know, I was the guy that started the restoration on that airplane, and it took us 9 years but I love it. That's the best restoration in the whole wide world. Of course, you realize I'm prejudiced. I was so familiar with that airplane that blindfolded I could reach everything and do everything that I needed to without any problem at all. And
probably still could.
I probably, well, maybe. Been a long time.
Most veterans can't say they still have their airplane, but many still have their uniform. It was the only set of clothes many vets had upon returning home, and many wore it proudly until it wore out.
Yeah, there's a lot of, they can't believe that they actually use some of the stuff because it's pretty crude by today's standards, and a lot of it's just fond memories. They remember their dad coming home in uniform, or they remember seeing pictures of their dad or their mom in uniform and getting letters and stuff. And some of it, it's pretty emotional because some guys didn't come back. And I had a lady here today that her dad didn't come back from France. And I talked to her for quite a while because she was looking at some of the patches he would have worn. And it was kind of emotional for her and for me to hear her stories.
Tony Standifer began collecting uniforms after his grandfathers gave him the uniforms they had worn. One grandfather told of serving as a guard at the Tehran Conference for Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. This is the uniform that was there.
I just hope that they remember what the men and women of our country and the countries that were fighting with us did for us today. And a lot of times I think people forget, and you always hear stories about high school kids not knowing what Pearl Harbor was or who we fought in World War II, and that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to help people remember and educate them as to what my grandparents did and what possibly their parents did and that type of thing.
Then the third category was what we call the American at Risk category. Those became more popular as the war wore on, and the Office of War Information determined that the posters had to have more impact, had to have a little more shock value, because people were getting a little bit tired of hearing the same messages over and over. And so what they decided to do there was to create images that were very powerful, images of, say, children standing in a yard with their toys and this giant swastika shadow being cast upon them. Images of, paranoia images that evoked fear in the American people. So that was the third category, and those are also the ones where we showed our enemies, Hitler and the Japanese. We would we show them as caricatures, and as rats or snakes and things like that, so that people were aware that that American people were aware that they were ruthless.
In case you tuned in late, ladies and gentlemen, we are standing by for late news on the invasion of the Philippines. And in the meantime, we are presenting from San Francisco music by George Wright at the organ.
The 1940s was really a different culture, different attitudes, but there was a common enemy, and it was perhaps the last decade where the American people were really galvanized and supporting each other. The idea of some of these messages and some of these posters working today is laughable. So, yeah, it's interesting to look back on it, and it's difficult to really appreciate how successful these posters were.
FlightFest95 was more than a celebration of the airplanes of World War II. It was also a celebration of the times. With the music of the Tuxedo Junction Big Band, the weekend was truly a sentimental journey.
I only know one airplane real well, B-17.
How do you know that one?
Well, I flew them in the war. And got shot down in one. And the experience of being shot down and landing in one piece in a really busted up airplane led me to Boeing. Because I felt anybody that could build an airplane that could do what that airplane did deserves me.
Donald Sack's B-17 was shot down over Germany on New Year's Eve in 1944. A young woman whom he had met at a bus stop back home was told a few days later that her sweetheart was missing in action. Neither knew when or if they would ever see each other again.
My experience in the war was such that I was very, very lucky to come out of it and still be here, okay? It was a tough one. And there was a lot of guys that never made it. And I think about those folks a lot. And how lucky I am not only to be here thinking about them, but to be able to talk about them and talk about that airplane.
The young B-17 pilot survived that night of broken glass and wreckage. And the young woman he met at the bus stop said yes when he finally returned to ask her to marry him. This weekend, they celebrate not only 50 years of life, but 50 years of life together.
It's that second time that you hear your love song sung.
Well, it really takes you right back to that time and your thoughts and fears and hopes and dreams and so forth. And our 50th wedding anniversary will be Monday, on the July 3rd. So, you know, it really is a very meaningful weekend for us.
So glad we met the second time around.
You know, tens of thousands of crew members on these proud warbirds never came back from their missions. It is in their honor that we remember what they did, and as their legacy that we keep these airplanes around so that future generations will know them as wings of freedom. I'm Rick Price. Thanks for sharing this adventure with us. We look forward to flying with you again soon.